Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Chris. They said it couldn't be done, but you can do it because this is actually a real mensch. This guy actually, there aren't too many Stanford people I would appear with, but Chris is one of them. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the invitation. This is the problem of the millennium. And in the last, 50 years, we have gone from a society that basically cooked at home, prepared its own food, to now a society that doesn't even know how to cook. We've lost an important, and I would say seminal and integral component of our lifestyle in the process of basically two-parent working families, shuttling kids back and forth to and from this activity, that activity, and of course the money that has gone out the window in terms of processed food and in terms of healthcare. So I want to today take a step backward and do for you what Chris and I do on a daily basis. How many of you in the room today are scientists? How many of you use the scientific method in your daily lives or in your research? A couple of you, okay? Well, for those of you who don't, I have to describe for you what it is that we do in order for you to understand how we come to such a conclusion as what's on this title slide, an experiment that failed. So you have to understand what an experiment is, and you have to know what success or failure is. So let me take you through that. So here's a slide of sort of what I do on a daily basis. You pose a hypothesis based on the data that's currently available, and you say, this must be true, and I'm going to test it by setting up a procedure that will evaluate that hypothesis and exclude all confounders. So you design the experiment, and you determine what the outcome should be a priori, and you then either support or you refute that hypothesis. Right? You assess the baseline parameters before you walk into the experiment, so you know where you're starting, so you know what the change will be over the course of the experiment. You carry out the experiment and you gather the data as you go, and you figure out what's going on during the course of the experiment so that you can ultimately work backwards to figure out what happened if you need to. You assess the outcome parameters as you reach the end of whatever the interval that you were studying was. And if the outcome is as expected, you publish it, you get grant money, you move on to the next experiment and the next hypothesis. That's great. And if the outcome is not as expected, which is about 10 times more likely than the experiment actually working, your job is to figure out what happened. What went wrong? Was it because the procedure itself was flawed and you couldn't actually get the data out of it that you thought, because it's garbage in, garbage out? Or was it because the hypothesis was flawed and you need to move on to another hypothesis? So you have to ask the question, do I want to repeat the experiment and do it differently, or do I want to do a completely different experiment? And that's the situation that all scientists face when an experiment fails, which is virtually all the time. Everybody got it? That's what I have to do. That's what Chris has to do. That's what the people who raise their hands have to do. Okay? And I'll tell you, it's a hell of a way to make a living. But that's what we do. All right? So let's imagine that the food industry 50 years ago posed a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is illustrated on this slide right here, that processed food is better than real food. That's what they said 50 years ago. And they said it for a whole bunch of different reasons, and we understand what those reasons are. And we've adopted a lot of those reasons, and we've sort of inculcated those into our daily lives. Now, what are the outcomes that you have to look at to determine whether or not this hypothesis is correct? Well, you have to look at consumption. Did consumption go up? Yes or no? Did health improve? Yes or no? Did the environment get better or worse? And finally, cash flow. Did companies make money? Did consumers save money? And did society do well or not? These are the questions that ultimately will determine the success or failure of this experiment. Everybody got it? So that's what we're going to analyze today, because the food industry refuses to. So we're going to do it for them. Got it? Okay. So here's the experiment. 1965. Everybody remember these? Okay, Swanson TV dinners, the first ultra-processed marketed fast food, processed food, and it was in everybody's home. And they told us that this was going to liberate women from the kitchen. Now, has it? Yeah, it sort of has. And that's one of the reasons why we have two-parent working families now and nobody to shuttle your kids and all the daycare and everything else. In fact, it did liberate women from the kitchen, because if we didn't have those, they probably still would be in the kitchen. Whether that's a good thing or not is up to your own decision-making. And Spam, everybody remember Spam, right? Okay. So that was 50 years ago. Okay? This is what we have now. And everybody recognizes all of these. Okay? So the processed food industry has certainly advanced and evolved over the past 50 years to provide us with all of this fare, which we are now consuming. But what's interesting is, with all of the different processed food that's out there for us to be able to choose from today, how many companies do you think make those? No, it turns out there are 10. And here they are. Okay? Kraft, Coke, Pepsi, Kellogg's, Mars, Unilever, J&J, P&G, and Nestle. Okay? They control 90% of the food distribution and marketing in this country. These 10 conglomerates. And to be honest with you, they all do the exact same things. So that's very interesting. So basically, our food has been uniformly changed over the past 50 years. A very good experiment in terms of before and after. So let's talk about that. Okay? So here's what processed food is. Number one, it has to be mass-produced, okay, on a big scale. You know, we're not talking about individual chefs here. We're talking about, you know, conglomerates. Anybody ever been to a food processing plant? You have, huh? What was it like? It's a plant. Are there any windows? There are no windows. Why is that? Why are there no windows in a food processing plant? Because they don't want you to see what's going on in there. Because if you did, you wouldn't eat it. Okay? Truly. You can't believe what's going on there. There is not one piece of machinery that is recognizable that would be in a normal kitchen. Nothing. Nada. It's fascinating. Really very interesting. It has to be consistent batch to batch, because not just batch to batch, but in fact location to location, because they're making it in different places at different times. Okay? Has to be consistent country to country, for obvious reasons, like McDonald's, right? You know, because after all, you know, it's McDonald's. It carries the brand. It's got to, you know, convey a certain taste. Specialized ingredients from specialized companies. We're not talking about, you know, just food here. We're talking about all sorts of additives, and we're talking about all sorts of other things that you add to the food in order to make those things consistent from country to country. Virtual every macronutrient is pre-frozen. The only thing that's not pre-frozen are the spices. Everything comes from a freezer. Fascinating, really. Okay? And that means that the fiber had to be removed, because what happens when you freeze fiber? You get mush. Go home, take an orange, put it in your freezer overnight, take it out the next day, put it on the counter, thaw it, try to eat it, see what you get. What do you get? You get mush, because the ice crystals macerate the cell wall of the plant with the orange, okay, and allow the water to rush in and turns it into mush. But of course, food industry knows that. So what do? They squeeze it and freeze it, lasts forever. Goes from being a food to being a commodity. That's the definition of a commodity, storable food. And you can buy and sell commodities on a commodities exchange. You can't buy and sell food on a food exchange, but you can with commodities. So this works for people trying to make money. Okay? It has to stay emulsified. What does that mean? Anybody know what emulsifiers are? So these are chemicals, they're detergents, really, that help bring fat and water together. All right? That's why you add detergents to the washing machine, is so that you can get the soaps to the stain. Otherwise, you couldn't do that. So what happens if those emulsifiers are working inside your intestine? What do you think happens? It actually strips off the mucus layer of the epithelial cells inside your intestine. And there are actually studies now, in animals at least, we don't have it, human studies, that say that you can actually show closer apposition of the food to the cells because the mucus layer has been damaged and has actually been lost in some cases. And that may be part of the problem of food allergy and irritable bowel syndrome and several of the other food-related diseases that we know about today, although that's not known for sure yet. But there was a paper in Nature just 3 weeks ago that posed that, at least in animals. Okay? And again, it has to have very long shelf life or freezer life. Everybody knows the 10-year-old Twinkie, right? Right? It's got to last forever. Right? And that's, again, for depreciation. Okay. So let's list what processed food is, how it's different from real food. Everybody got it? So not enough what? Not enough fiber, because you have to take the fiber out in order to freeze it. Not enough omega-3 fatty acids, which you find in wild fish, not farmed fish, because the fish don't make the omega-3s. What makes the omega-3s? The algae make the omega-3s. The fish eat the algae, we eat the fish. So if you're consuming farmed fish, which is processed food, you might as well be eating a steak. All right, everybody got that? Very important you understand that. So you have to know where your fish comes from. Well, of course, how do you find out? Sometimes not so easy. Okay. Micronutrients, okay? Not enough micronutrients because the micronutrients travel with the fiber fraction. So when you remove the fiber, you remove a lot of the micronutrients. So most of the processed food is deficient in micronutrients that we need in order to be able to metabolize food properly. And then there's a whole bunch of things that are too much. Too much trans fats. Now, we know that trans fats are bad. This stuff is consumable poison. So much so that the Food and Drug Administration finally, after 25 years, finally on November 7th, 2013, agreed that trans fats were not generally recognized as safe. And so they will be disappearing from our food supply. Hooray. Took 25 years. Okay. What else? Branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine. These are 3 amino acids that you have to eat, you can't make, and levels of these in your blood correlate with metabolic syndrome, all the cardiovascular, diabetes diseases, the non-communicable diseases, all the chronic diseases that we know are all on the rise. And levels of these amino acids correlate with those in humans, and they are higher in corn-fed anything, which of course is processed food. Corn-fed beef, corn-fed chicken, corn-fed fish, which is farm fish. Okay? Omega-6 fatty acids. So what are omega-6s? Those are pro-inflammatory. Now you need omega-6s, you need omega-3s, you need both, but you need them in the right ratio, and omega-6s is what you find in seed oils, like corn oil, soybean oil. And these are pro-inflammatory. Now you need inflammation because you need to be able to knock out bacteria, you need to be able to mount an immune response when you're sick and have a virus, etc. But you don't need it all the time. So we're supposed to have an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 1 to 1, we're told. We right now have an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 25 or 30 to 1. So the question is that pro-inflammatory or not? All these different additives, and I don't want to get into all the different additives because we could go off for 10 hours on all the different additives, and that would just, there's not enough videotape in the camera for that. Emulsifiers, like I mentioned, okay, the ones that you may have heard of are called polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose. Those are the emulsifiers that are typically used. Too much salt, right? Everybody knows about salt. So salt's very complicated. There are some people who are exquisitely salt sensitive, and they need a reduction in their salt content. And there are some people who aren't as salt sensitive, and it's not as important. Now, as a doctor, I care about everybody, and we are triple over our salt limit. So I'm for reducing salt, but when you look at the data, it's complicated as to who benefits and who doesn't. But nonetheless, it's still a good thing to reduce salt. And then the big one, the big kahuna, the in-your-face, the you can't touch this, sugar. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk mostly about today, because the food industry uses sugar like you use salt. Okay? They hype up virtually every food to make it more palatable, and they do it with sugar. Why? Because there are 5 taste buds on your tongue. Okay? There's sweet, of course. There's salty. There's sour. There's umami. Everybody knows what that is? That's like roast beef or soy sauce. And then there's bitter. So here are examples of each of those. So sugar hides salty. That's like Chex Mix or honey roasted peanuts. It hides sour, like the German wines. You know, I mean, nobody would drink that stuff except that they add a little bit of Swiss Reserve back, because there's so much citric acid in the German wines because they don't get any sun, okay, that you have to cut the acidity, and you do it with sugar. It's the same reason why you add a little sugar to your salad dressing when you make balsamic vinegar and oil, because it cuts the sourness or a little bit. How about, and lemonade, of course. It cuts umami, like sweet and sour pork. You know, that's half soy sauce. You wouldn't touch that, except you add a little sugar. You can't even tell that there was any soy sauce in there. And then finally, it cuts bitter, like milk chocolate, right? Okay. So why? Here's why. Because there are no foodstuffs in nature that are both sweet and acutely poisonous. None. It was the signal to our ancestors that any given food that they found in nature was safe to eat and wouldn't make them keel over and die. Liking sweet is ingrained into our DNA. We love this stuff. We will go out of our way for this stuff. It is completely vestigial from a metabolic standpoint. It gives us no benefit in terms of anything but as an energy source. There is no biochemical reaction in the body that requires dietary sugar. Yet, we love it anyway. And a perfect example of this is ackee fruit. Everybody know Jamaican ackee fruit? So anybody ever seen this stuff? It's over here on the right. So, if you live in Jamaica, you know don't eat the ackee fruit until it's either bloomed, like here, or it's fallen from the tree. Because if you eat the ackee fruit when it's immature, there is a compound in it called hypoglycin. And this hypoglycin can actually lower your blood sugar to about 5 and causes something called Jamaican vomiting sickness, and you can die from it, and I've actually seen a case of that. Okay? But if you wait till it blooms, the hypoglycin is metabolized, and now it's safe to eat. And of course, it's the Jamaican national dish, and they can it and send it all over the country, all over the world. Okay? And it's basically, you know, what they eat. Okay. So the question is this stuff addictive? Well, we know that there are certain things that are addictive and hazardous to our health. The question is, what about this stuff? Is this stuff addictive and hazardous to our health? Depends on who you ask. If you ask the chief medical officer of Amsterdam, Paul van der Welpen, he will tell you that sugar is both addictive and the most dangerous drug of our times. Okay, this is coming from Amsterdam. Really? And they would know something about that. Okay? I mean, you know, think about that. Really. Well, in fact, we actually know this too. Why do we know this? Because of this stuff. Anybody recognize this? Anybody work in a neonatal intensive care unit or in a newborn nursery? Anybody know what this stuff over here is? It's called Sweeties. Sweeties. What is it? It is a super concentrated sucrose sugar solution that you dip stick the pacifier in and then stick in the newborn boy's mouth before you do the circumcision. Oh! The Jews use wine. Everybody else uses sweeties. So we know, okay? It releases endogenous opioids, okay? Because that's our endogenous painkiller. It's an opiate, okay? And it does the same thing as opiates do. So here's the key. Of the 600,000 food items that you can find in the American grocery store today, 74% of them have added sugar. And of the 4,000 packaged items in the American food supply that were looked at recently in this article that just came out like a week ago, only 50% had greater than the recommendation for added salt. So what does that mean? That means that sugar is actually the marker for processed food even more than salt is, because sugar's in more things than salt is. So that's the question for today. Is sugar public enemy number one? Because it is not just the marker for processed food, but it is the thing that distinguishes processed food. And the question is it okay in the doses that we are currently exposed to in processed food by the food industry, because it hides all the other negative aspects of food and gets you to buy more? That's the question for today, and that's the experiment. If you add sugar to your diet, what happens to you? And that's the last 50 years. Okay? So let's look at the outcomes. So remember we said consumption, health, environment, cash flow. Those are our 4 outcome variables. So let's look at the first one, consumption. So you could say, well, we definitely have a consumption problem. Because over there on the left, we have the original White Castle hamburger, right? Before processed food, 210 calories. And then over there in the middle, we have Bob's Big Boy at 618 calories. And in the midst of the obesity epidemic, Hardee's had the temerity to offer us the Thick Burger at 1,420 calories. And of course, you can go today to Carl's Jr. just down the street on El Camino Real and get the $6 burger at 2,000 calories. And so you say, QED, there you go. That's what it's all about. Consumption's up. Oh, consumption's way up, no question. In fact, total calories are up over the last 25 years. In men, 187 calories per day more than 25 years ago. In women, 335 calories a day more than 25 years ago. In teen boys, in this slide, 275 calories more than 25 years ago. Yes, we are all eating more. Consumption is definitely up since the advent of processed food. Slam dunk. But what are we eating more of? Is it fat? Not really, no. In fact, fat's about the same. 5 grams, 45 calories. So here's the secular trends in specific food intake. And if you take a look at what's circled in purple, that's all the fats. So whole milk, way down, right? We were told really bad for you because it had saturated fat. Well, it turns out, you know what? A saturated fat isn't necessarily saturated fat. Turns out that dairy saturated fats have a very different metabolic signature than do red meat saturated fats. And they may actually be protective for diabetes and possibly even protective for heart disease based on epidemiologic studies. But we lumped them all together. Okay? So whole milk, way down. Meat and cheese up very slightly. Milk, desserts. Bottom line, it's a wash. That's what the data say. And in fact, we are eating exactly the same amount of fat as we did before. But because calories have gone up, because consumption's gone up, the percent of calories as fat has gone down because we've gone from 40 to 30% because we were told to. We were told by the USDA, the original dietary guidelines of 1977 told us to reduce our consumption of total fat and saturated fat from 40 to 30%. And guess what? We've done it. And look what has happened. Wow, you want an experiment? You want an outcome that you can measure? Oh, we got it. We got it big. So what are we eating more of if it's not fat? Well, it's carbohydrate. 228 calories. Eating lots more carbohydrate, okay? And here's that same slide I showed you before, but now the carbohydrate is circled as well, and you can see all of them through the roof. That's what's gone up, carbohydrate. And in particular, what carbohydrate? Well, 41% increase in soft drinks, 35% increase in fruit drinks, fruit aids, etc. Okay? Just remember, 1 can of soda a day is 150 calories times 365 days a year, divided by the magic number 3,500 calories in a pound, which I don't even believe, but that's what the dietitian will tell you. Okay? And so that's worth 15.5 pounds a year. It's actually worth more. It's worth more. Because things that make your insulin go up higher make you gain more weight even on the same number of calories. And my friend Dr. Gardner will explain that when he talks with you later. Okay? So what is this stuff? Well, in America, it's this stuff here, right? High fructose corn syrup. Why high fructose corn syrup? Well, number one, it's from corn, right? Anybody know the dirtiest 4-letter word in the English language? No, it's not corn. There's a dirtier 4-letter word in the English language. Iowa. Because Iowa is the first presidential caucus. And you can't win the presidency if you don't win Iowa. Ask John McCain. Okay? No one wants to touch us. This is the third rail of American politics. No one wants to touch this. And of course, corn is the second dirtiest word for the same reason. Okay. So our current annual consumption is 63 pounds per person, but interestingly, only the US, Canada, Japan, and very limited exposure in parts of Europe use this stuff. Yet, the entire rest of the world has the exact same problem we do. In fact, diabetes rates are higher in China and in India than they are here, and they don't have high fructose corn syrup. It's actually as high in Australia as it is here, and they don't have high fructose corn syrup. What do they have? They just have table sugar. They have sucrose. So here's the difference. So high fructose corn syrup is on the top. So it's either 42 or 55% fructose, that 5-membered ring on the right. That's the sweet molecule. That's the one we seek. That's the one that's addictive. Glucose, over there on the left, that 6-membered ring, that's the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so goddamn important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. So, is glucose a nutrient? Sure. Is glucose an essential nutrient? No. Because you don't need it, because your body will make it. Unless you have glycogen storage disease, in which case then you have to come to me as a pediatric endocrinologist. But short of that, everybody else makes it. But this stuff over here, this 5-membered ring, fructose, no biochemical reaction in a vertebrate that requires dietary fructose. It's completely vestigial. It is an energy source. That's true. But it provides no nutrition because there's no biochemical reaction that requires it. Can anybody name an energy source that has absolutely no function in the body, that we like a lot, but that is toxic in high dose? Alcohol, thank you. Alcohol. Alcohol is an energy source, but alcohol is not nutrition, yet we love it, yet it's toxic, and we regulate it. Sugar's the same thing, because fructose is metabolized exactly like alcohol. In fact, sugar is the alcohol of the child. And that's why children today are getting the diseases of alcohol, type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, without drinking alcohol, because they've just substituted one addictive substance for another. Everybody got it? And that's, of course, why the food industry puts it in. Okay. So that explains this right here. So I call this slide very specifically the Coca-Cola Conspiracy, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay? They haven't sued me yet. So over there on the left, 1915, the original 6.5-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola, standardized out of Atlanta. If you drank one of those every day for a year, that'd be worth 8 pounds of fat per year. Then, after World War II, when sugar became plentiful again after rationing, okay, we had the 10-ounce bottle, first one found in vending machines over there. That would be worth 13 pounds of fat per year. Okay, then, of course, in 1960, we got the ever ubiquitous 12-ounce can, okay, which is worth 16 pounds of fat per year. And, of course, today, that is the single unit of measure over there, the 20-ounce bottle. It's the only one you can now find anywhere. And that's, if you drank one of those every day, that would be worth 26 pounds of fat per year. But how many servings are in that bottle? Anybody know? 2.5. 2.5 8-ounce servings in that bottle. Anybody know anybody who gets 2.5 8-ounce servings out of that? That's a single serving, okay? And then finally, in the middle, we have the 7-Eleven Big K Thirst Buster Big Gulp, 44 ounces, worth 57 pounds per year. And my colleague, Dr. Dan Hale, tells me that down at the University of Texas, San Antonio, they got a Texas-sized Big Gulp. 60 ounces of Coca-Cola, Snickers bar, and a bag of Doritos, all for 99 cents. That is what processed food has brought us. That would be worth 112 pounds of fat per year. And by the way, in case you didn't know, on April 11th, that is this Saturday, 2 days from today, 7-Eleven is offering a promotion. Bring any vessel from your home that is not an inflatable pool and fill it up with Slurpee for $1.49. You think I'm kidding. I ain't kidding. Okay? That they will not take inflatable pools. Okay. So, oh, and before I get there. So why do I call it the Coca-Cola Conspiracy? Well, what's in Coke? Let's start with something else. What? Caffeine, caffeine. Thank you, caffeine. So what's caffeine? It's a mild stimulant, and it's also a diuretic. Works on the kidney to make you urinate free water. What else is in Coke? Salt, 55 milligrams per can. So what happens if you take on salt and lose free water? You get thirstier, right? So why is there so much sugar in Coke? To hide the salt. I showed you that already. Now, do you have to make soda with salt? Anybody ever heard of Royal Crown Cola? It's long gone, okay? But you probably grew up with it, okay? Tastes bad? No, it was perfectly fine. 0 sodium. You don't have to put salt in Coke, but they do, because they know, because they get you to drink more. So, Coca-Cola Conspiracy. They know what they're doing, and you don't. So here is the last 200 years of sugar consumption in the United States. Starting in 1820, when we got fruits and vegetables out of the ground with the occasional honey, it was worth about 4 pounds of sugar per year. And over here, we topped out at about 100 pounds of sugar per year. And you can see the different phases of sugar consumption and production in the United States. We had the growth of the sugar industry in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, in Louisiana, in the Bayou, and in Hawaii. Okay? And then we had stabilization where, you know, production, correlated with price, you know, so you reached equilibrium. Then you had rationing during World War II, as you can see there. And then it came back up to the same level. And then we had processed food. And then on top of that, we got high fructose corn syrup, which was half the price. And so what happened? Whew. Oh, and plus we went low fat, all at the same time. Everything happened at once. And so we went sailing over. So where is the sugar in our food right now? So half of it's in soft drinks, as you can see. And by the way, on April 22nd, our state legislators will be debating a soda label warning ban on the can or on the bottle. Okay, and I was actually in Sacramento lobbying for this for the California Center for Public Health Advocacy just 3 weeks ago. Okay? And I will tell you, I followed the chief scientist for Pepsi-Cola, who was there as well, Danielle Greenberg. Fascinating. Okay, so you know what's going on. There's a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, half of it's in soft drinks, but that means that half of it's not. Half of it's in stuff you didn't know had it, like salad dressing, barbecue sauce, tomato sauce, breakfast cereal, hamburger buns, hamburger meat, for that matter, yogurt. And who here thinks that yogurt is healthy? Plain yogurt is healthy. Okay? The Europeans eat plain yogurt and then throw whole fruit in to cut the sourness. Because, you know, like, what is yogurt? It's sour milk, right? What's the difference between yogurt and the milk that sours in your refrigerator? So for yogurt, you get to choose the bacteria that does the souring. That's it. That's the big difference. All right? But in America, yogurt is not sour milk. Yogurt is dessert. That's what's happened. That's what processed food brought us. Yogurt for dessert. Okay. So now we've agreed that consumption's up. Let's do health. So what's happened to health? I know what's happened to health care, okay, because I'm a doctor, and let me tell you, it sucks. But what's happened to health? So let's look. This is from the New England Journal. Let's look at what's happened. So smoking down, blood pressure down, cholesterol down, physical activity up. We should be reaping a health benefit from all of those things happening, right? Shouldn't we? Well, we're not. How come? Because obesity's up and diabetes is way up. Off the charts in every developed and developing country, right? India, 11% diabetes. China, 11% diabetes. We're only at 9.3% diabetes, but another 40% of us are pre-diabetic. So just diabetes waiting to happen. And that is cutting our lives short. And that is reducing money going into the system. And it's increasing the money going out of the system, which we'll talk about when we get to cash flow. So here's the problem right here. It's on this slide. Everybody remember Coca-Cola's Coming Together campaign from 2 years ago? It was on all the football games. This was their response to the obesity epidemic. And this is a direct quote from their campaign commercial. Beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. In other words, you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or you can get your calories from kumquats. Doesn't matter. If you eat more than you burn, you'll gain weight. If you eat less than you burn, you will lose weight. Therefore, a calorie is a calorie. It's about calorie balance. It's about you eat too much, you exercise too little. It's about diet and exercise. It's about if you're fat, it's your fault. It's about any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. And it's about why pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. Now, every one of those mantras has been ingrained across your forehead over the last 50 years. A calorie is a calorie. And it's common sense. They say so. You know what? I don't believe in common sense. I believe in science. I believe in data. And what the data say are completely different. What the data say are that some calories cause disease more than others because different calories are metabolized differently in the body. It's called nutritional biochemistry. And you want to know the kicker of all this? I learned this in college. I majored in nutritional biochemistry at MIT. In 1975, I knew this. And then I went to medical school. And they beat it out of me. And I forgot all this. Because that wasn't what we learned in medical school. We learned a calorie was a calorie. We learned obesity was the problem. We learned that if you eat too much and you exercise too little, you gain weight. And we learned that that fat that you gained caused all of the metabolic disturbances that we now see. And then I started doing my own research in 1995. And you know what? By 2005, I was absolutely convinced a calorie was not a calorie. And I came to the realization, wait a second. I started having night sweats. I started waking up in the middle of the night with like post-traumatic stress disorder. Because like, I knew this. And I had lost it. And I got it back. Maybe that's why I'm so passionate about it now, is because medical education does not discuss this, because they don't get it. They don't understand it. And this is sort of one of the seminal ends of the stool, that you can basically, hold on to. And if you kick that out from under, what happens to, your understanding of physiology, of science, of nutrition, of biochemistry, and of health? Basically, we're kicking it out from under. And people don't want it kicked out. And so there's this big fight, this big tension. And that's why we're having this discussion now. But a calorie is not a calorie. Now, how do I know that? Because we have the data. So here is a study from Europe called the EPIC Interact study. And what they did was they asked, do sugared sweetened beverages cause diabetes? So if you look at the red box at the bottom, what they did was it's called the adjusted model. They looked at every sugared beverage per day, adjusted for its calories and adjusted for its effects on obesity by BMI. And they showed that every sugar beverage increases your risk for diabetes by 29%. And we're not consuming one sugar beverage, we're consuming 2.5 on average. So take that up to 68%. Okay. We did this study, which didn't look at consumption, we looked at availability within countries. What we did was we took the Food and Agriculture Organization statistics database, which listed line item, country by country for the entire decade, 2000 to 2010. Total calories, fruits excluding wine, meats, cereals, fiber-containing foods, oils, sugar crops, and sweeteners. Line by line, item by item, for the whole decade, country by country. We then regressed that with the International Diabetes Federation statistics database for diabetes prevalence, country by country for the same period. And then we regressed that with the World Bank Gross National Income Database, which controls for poverty, urbanization, aging, physical activity, and obesity, all the confounders. Remember, you have to adjust for the confounders when you do science, right? And we asked the question, what about the world's diet predicts diabetes change country by country over the decade? And the answer, only sugar. Nothing else. Nothing else even came close. For every 150 calories extra any country ate, diabetes prevalence went up a total of 0.1%. Nada. But if those 150 calories happened to be a can of soda instead, diabetes prevalence went up 11-fold, 1.1%. And again, we're not drinking one soda a day, we're drinking 2.5. This study actually meets the criteria which were set up by Austin Bradford Hill back in the 60s to implicate tobacco and lung cancer. That is dose, more sugar, more diabetes. Duration, longer sugar exposure, more diabetes. Directionality, countries where sugar went up, more diabetes. Countries where sugar went down, and there were a few, less diabetes. And most importantly, for causation, you have to show precedence. 3 years. Whenever sugar changed, diabetes changed in the same direction 3 years later. That's causation. Same level of proof we have today for tobacco and lung cancer. Okay? Okay. Why? Here's why. Because sugar drives fat accumulation in the liver. That's why. Because when you put fat in your liver, then your pancreas has to make more insulin, and that burns out the pancreas and causes diabetes. And you can see from this study from my colleague Jean-Marc Schwartz, that was just in JCNM like 3 weeks ago. You can see that you can do the control period and then the sugar, or you can do the sugar period, then the control. Bottom line, it doesn't matter. The amount of liver fat went up 38% for the same number of calories over a 2-week period. And that drives insulin resistance, and that drives increased pancreatic insulin release, which then drives chronic metabolic disease. And we just had an abstract at the Endocrine Society just a month ago, and you can read it here. Restricting fructose in obese Latino and African-American children reduces fat accumulation in the liver. 30% reduction on the same number of calories in 10 days, which also improved their insulin resistance and every other aspect of their metabolic health without changing weight. It didn't change their subcutaneous or big butt fat. It changed their visceral fat, and it absolutely lowered their liver fat. Same number of calories, because a calorie is not a calorie. And this is for heart disease death. This was published last year by Yang et al. From Harvard School of Public Health and the CDC. So what you're looking at here is a histogram of percent of calories consumed as added sugar over a 2-decade period. And the median of this histogram is 18%. Can you believe that? Half the country consumed more than 18% of their calories as added sugar. That's insane. It's supposed to be 4%. It was at 18%. Okay? Now that red line in the center is the hazard risk ratio for heart disease death. And the inflection point is at 15%. Median's 18%, inflection point 15%. So what does that mean? It means that more than half of the United States has an increased risk of heart disease death due to their added sugar consumption. Controlling for obesity, controlling for calories, just because of the added sugar. Because it's not about the calories, and it's not about the obesity. Alcohol is not dangerous because it's calories. Alcohol is not dangerous because it causes obesity. Alcohol is dangerous because it's alcohol. Sugar is the same thing. It's dangerous because it's sugar, because of its unique stereochemistry and because of what it does and because of how the liver metabolizes it, because it's not necessary, because it's not really a nutrient. It's an energy source, it's not a nutrient. In fact, we have causation for these 4 diseases, and these 4 diseases will be on that warning label if the California State Legislature passes the motion. Diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, and tooth decay. We have causation for every single one of those. The ones we only have correlation for today, so we don't discuss them yet, is cancer and dementia. But I'm really interested in both of those. And I just met with Stan Prusner, the Nobel Prize winner up at UCSF, about whether or not sugar could cause dementia and how we might be able to actually look at that question going forward in the next couple of years. So now let's do environment. Now we've talked about health. Now let's do environment. Is sugar good or bad for the environment? What do you think? So this was from the World Wildlife Fund, sugar in the environment. And what does it do? Well, it does a lot of bad stuff. Okay, basically what it does is it causes a lot of soil erosion, and it causes a lot of phosphate runoff. And so it's actually poisoning the Amazon, and it's poisoning the Everglades. Here's the sugar holdings in the Everglades. Just look at the orange and the yellow and the light green. That's all sugar. That's like Okeechobee there in the upper left corner. Okay? And in fact, it's getting worse because Florida's governor has actually given them a bigger subsidy to be able to expand their operations in the Everglades. Now, who here thinks that's a good idea? And finally, let's do cash flow. So we said we start with companies. So here's what processed food did. So here's 1982 over here on the left, and here's 2012 over here on the right. Look what's happened. Meats, down 10% because we were all told to go low fat. Fruits and vegetables, notice exactly the same. No change in fruits and vegetables. Now, we're always told we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, and that's likely true. I'm sure that is true. We don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. But you know what? We never did. We never did. And we didn't have this problem in 1982, but we sure as hell have it now. Grains and baked goods, 13% to 14%. And that's important because grain and baked goods mean refined carbohydrate, which means glucose, which means insulin, and insulin means weight gain, and that's part of the obesity equation. No argument there. And that is a problem. And that's, of course, another marker for processed food, all that carbohydrate we talked about, right? Dairy products. 13.2% down to 10.6%, because now we're all lactose intolerant. You laugh, okay? But if dairy is actually protective for diabetes and heart disease, which actually some of the data now is starting to look like, that's a problem too. And then finally, in yellow, processed foods and sweets, 11.6, 22.9%, a doubling in the span of 30 years. That's what processed food brought us. And the question is that okay? Well, it was okay for stock prices, that's for sure. So here's the S&P 500 from 2007 to 2011. Notice the economic downturn of 2008 right over there, okay? In blue is the S&P, and you can see there's McDonald's, Coke, and Pepsi's stock price over that period of time. They were doing very well, thank you. Okay? And here's Hormel, ADM, General Mills, ConAgra, Procter & Gamble, and Kraft against the S&P. Want to make money? Invest in a food company for that same period of time, 2007 to 2011. But guess what? The word is out. There's a problem. And so these are the sugar companies. Notice Tate & Lyle, Elovo, Südzucker against the S&P. Not doing all of a sudden so well over the past 2 years. So all of a sudden cash flow, not so good if stock prices are going down. And take a look at soft drink companies. They're all of a sudden experiencing a drought. Here's McDonald's, there's Coke, there's Pepsi, there's Dr. Pepper Snapple. They've introduced a couple of new products which kind of piqued them over here recently. But they're having problems too because people are onto it. There's been a definite reduction in soft drinks, except for one thing. There's been a commensurate increase in what? Well, yeah, but that's soft. They still run those. Energy drinks. Monster, right? And all those. So what did Coke do? They bought Monster. Because that's where the money is. Okay? How about consumers? What's gone on cash flow-wise? Now, there is no question that eating processed food costs less money long-term. Here's less healthy food going up by 7 cents per dollar versus healthy food going up 17 cents per dollar in the UK over a 10-year period. So the rise in cost of processed food has been much lower than that of real and healthy food. No argument. So you'd say, well, that means that there's a monetary benefit, right? You're saving money by consuming processed food, except, of course, you're consuming a whole lot more, right? Because of all of the effects that we've talked about, which aren't so good. So look at this. This is how much money as a percent of GDP each country on the planet spends on food. And take a look at us over there, 7%. We spend the least amount of our GDP on food at 7%. And of course, we're the most obese nation. Next comes the UK at 9%. Next comes Australia at 11%. Now take a look at the countries in purple that spend more than 36% of their GDP on food. They've all been in revolution in the last 3 to 4 years. And that's why. So there is definitely a cost-benefit analysis to be done here. Fluctuating food prices definitely cause political unrest. And processed food, instituted in the 1960s and early 1970s by policies passed by our country, for instance, Richard Nixon's advocation of changing the paradigm for farming. You know that before Richard Nixon, we used to pay farmers not to grow certain crops. Everybody, some of you may remember that. That was to artificially prop up the price of certain crops for the farmers. So what happened in 1971? He told Earl Butz, his agriculture secretary, to make food cheap because fluctuating food prices caused political unrest. And Richard Nixon had a lot of political unrest to deal with. And so what did Earl Butz do? He went to the heartland of the United States, to Nebraska, to Kansas, to Iowa, and told them 3 things. Row to row, furrow to furrow, get bigger, get out. And they did. That's what's happened. And so now we have monoculture. Now we have all the corn in Iowa, and we have all the cattle in Kansas. And so we have to use petroleum products to grow the corn in Iowa, and we have to use antibiotics to control the diseases in Kansas because there's no manure. So we have basically distorted the market. Yes, food's cheap, but what does that do? That causes disease. So take a look at this slide. So we're looking now at healthcare costs in this country and projected over the course of the next 10 years. And what you see is there's hospital in red, there's physician in green, and there's pharma in purple. And they don't add up to the total. Because what's going on? It's going to chronic metabolic disease. That's where all the extra money is going. And who's paying that freight? You are. So you're paying less for your food, but you're paying more for your health care. And if you're not paying more for your health care because you're not sick, you're paying more for the guy sitting next to you's health care because insurers and employers charge $2,750 per employee for obesity-related health care, whether the employee is obese or not. Who's paying that freight? You are. You're paying it. So your cash flow is not as good as you think it is. Yeah, you're saving money on food, processed food, like I just showed you, but you're paying it in health care. I guarantee you, you're losing on the dollar. And what about society? How is it affecting society? So remember, here's processed food. Remember this slide? Now I'm going to overlay onto this slide the percent of GDP spent on healthcare in the United States over the same period of time. Everybody ready? There it is. What do you see? When processed food started being produced, that's when healthcare costs skyrocketed. So we don't have the prevention, the treatment model in America. We have the sugar model. That's what this is. Okay? Now, if you do the math on this, the food industry grosses $1 trillion a year, of which $450 billion is gross profit, 45% gross profit. Yet healthcare costs in America are $2.7 trillion a year. 75% of those are chronic metabolic disease, all the diseases we've been talking about. And 75% of those are preventable if we could fix our diet. So when you do the math, that's $1.4 trillion a year going down a rat hole. You think we could do something with $1.4 trillion a year? So the food industry makes $450 billion. We spend $1.4 trillion cleaning up their mess. We spend triple what they make. This is a bad deal. This is a bad deal for society. And you're paying the freight while they get rich. And now they're not even getting so rich. Credit Suisse knows this. And they published this just 2 years ago called Sugar Consumption at a Crossroads. And get this. This is a global international investment bank. And they said, we believe higher taxation on sugary food and drinks would be the best option to reduce sugar intake and help fund the fast-growing healthcare costs associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity. This is a global investment bank calling for taxation. Are you kidding me? Are you friggin' kidding me? That's how big and bad this has gotten. And Morgan Stanley, just 2 weeks ago, published their report called The Bitter Aftertaste of Sugar. And I just throw one slide up here. Modeling into the future, based on high sugar or low sugar, the amount of economic growth that we can expect around the world. Doesn't look so good. So this is costing society big time, and more sugar is costing society even more. So let's do the scorecard. So let's imagine that the food industry posed this experiment and put all of these procedures into motion as a scientist would. Processed food is better than real food. So what do you think? Consumption, way up. That's for sure. Health, way down. In fact, death, way up. The IRB makes you report all deaths, all adverse events. And if they saw that graph of cardiovascular mortality, they would have shut this thing down in a nanosecond. There wouldn't be an experiment with those death rates. Environment, clearly, no good, with the Amazon and the Everglades being raped and pillaged. And cash flow. Companies, they made out really well. Their annual cash flow went from 1%, their annual profit margin went from 1% per year to 5% per year with the advent of processed food. They did really, really well. This was their juggernaut, but you know what? Now we see that not in the last 2 years, not so much. Now they're in trouble. Consumers do well in the short term because they save on the cost from 7 cents per dollar to 17 cents per dollar, but they spend it instead, long term, on health care instead. And finally, society. What a disaster. This is eating us up alive and completely unsustainable. And the Government Accountability Office says that Medicare will be broke by the year 2026. Well, I'm going to be 69 in the year 2026, and I want my friggin' Medicare. And so should you. So with that, all of this is in Fat Chance, which Nora told you about. We published a cookbook, Fat Chance Cookbook, because 1/3 of America now does not know how to cook because of the processed food pandemic, because they forgot. And you can't, where do you learn to cook? You learned it in one of two places. You learned it from your parents or you learned it in home ec. We don't have any home ec, and the parents now don't know how. So kids, basically, if you don't know how to cook, you're hostage to the food industry for the rest of your life. And this is what we have to bring back. We have to bring back real food, and we have to bring back how to cook it. And then we will be able to solve this problem. Sugar Science is a website that UCSF started in November. 8,000 clinical research articles vetted by 12 independent scientists who don't take money, and distilled down to 5 messages for the entire population that anyone can understand. The movie Fed Up, which you may have heard about, is now on Netflix, okay, which explains all of this very, very nicely. There is a new movie, a documentary that will be screened for the first time 2 weeks from now, and I'm going to Toronto to do Q&A, called Sugar Coated. You all know about the tobacco documents? Well, guess what? There are sugar documents too. And this is an analysis of the sugar documents and how the sugar industry basically obfuscated the truth in the 60s and 70s to get us to where we are today. And I can't wait. Sweet Revenge, a PBS special that we did that maybe some of you have seen, which explains all of this in, shall we say, a little bit more palatable way. And we've started a nonprofit here in San Francisco called the Institute for Responsible Nutrition to take on big food, to provide medical, nutritional, and legal analysis in the fight against big food. Because we have to solve this. We have no choice. And so if you liked what you heard today, log on, read it, sign up, be apprised, know what's going on. Obviously, the fact that you're here today means you care, and I appreciate that. We have to solve this problem. We have no choice, because it's our kids. Our kids are getting the diseases that old people got, that alcoholics got, okay? And they can't pay into the system. So there's no money for anything else. And that means you, and that means your Medicare, that means your livelihood, that means the United States. So if you care about our country, if you care about your kids, you need to care about this. Okay? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and I appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
Q&A.
That the conversation might go from here is the conversation with the audience asking you and Dr. Gardner questions, and we'll, until we get the microphones going, if you take a question, please repeat it so it can be picked up on the mic.
Who's bold and brave enough? Yes.
So the question is, well, then could you just substitute glucose for fructose? Well, that's what we did in that study that I showed you the abstract for. So basically, glucose raises your insulin, and insulin drives energy into fat. So it definitely increases your subcutaneous fat, and that's one of the reasons we've gotten fatter. But as what I hope I've shown you is that metabolic disease is not obesity. They are two different things. So China's not fat. India's not fat. But they have chronic metabolic disease now for the same reason we have chronic metabolic disease. In addition, we have fat healthy people. They're called metabolically healthy obese, MHO. Okay? So being fat and being sick are not the same thing. Glucose definitely causes insulin release, which definitely drives energy into fat. I don't argue that. We definitely need to reduce our refined carbohydrate consumption also, but that's what processed food is too. Processed food is fiberless food. And when you take the fiber out, you get refined carbohydrate. So let's eat real food, and then we don't have to worry about the carbohydrate. Would you
It's
agree?
fine. Yeah. Next question.
Can't thank you enough for this. Have you been to the White House yet?
No. Oh, they don't want to hear this.
And
don't wanna hear
so we need to get you into Michelle, and we need to get you into, and you should be on Oprah. And
There is no Oprah.
Elizabeth Warren should walk you into the White House, and we'll work on that. So you, at one point, and I missed because I was writing so fast, who, near the end, you said somebody or some institute or something didn't have the data to realize X. How good is your organization at getting this data to those kinds of decision makers? That's, I mean, it feels as though this room should be standing room only.
I'm going to tell you very honestly. The question is, how good is our organization at getting this information to decision makers? And the answer is, the decision makers don't want to hear it. That's the problem. Okay, there's something called ALEC or ALEC. You've heard, yeah. So, anybody heard of the American Legislative Exchange Council? Okay, so it's a front for the food industry and the pharma industry, and they give campaign contributions to 338 out of 535 congressmen. Okay, so there's other money involved here. Let me tell you a quick story. We're trying to work with the government of Mexico to monitor the effects of their soda tax. I was down in Mexico City in November, and I had to give a talk on economics to 20 economists, PhD economists. Okay? They're all Mexican, but they got their PhDs from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, U Chicago, and London School of Economics. 20 economists. I'm talking economics to economists. Okay? I got to tell you, that was really weird. And they told me straight out, and I said, I understand this. They said, it's not about the people. It's about the money. It's only about the money. You have to show us how this is going to either save us money or make us money. I said, I get it.
Well, so let me respond and tell you what we got going on right now. So as many of you know, every 5 years we redo the dietary guidelines for Americans. And it's 2015, it's time to do them again. And before you release them, a panel of about 15 scientists, a newly elected panel each 5 years, gets assigned to this. And a lot of you have probably seen this in the newspaper now, that just recently, last month, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee gave the recommendations to the USDA and the DHHS of what they should do this next round. And they want to put added sugar out there. That's one of their biggest things, is to cut back on added sugar. There's a lot of really interesting things. They looked at cholesterol. They're actually backing off on cholesterol. We could get into that discussion if you want. They've stuck with saturated fat being not so good for you. What I really like, what they did though, is they said we really got to stop arguing about nutrients. Everybody games the system on the nutrients. So what we're proposing in this round is that the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, and the vegetarian diet all have a lot of things in common, and they all have less packaged processed food. And so if we can stop bickering about nutrients and look at patterns of foods to eat, including having less animal-based foods and more plant-based foods. And so that's a discussion that's going on right now. Comments are open until May 8th. And it's a fascinating time because the food industry has launched a huge offensive against this. And they're giving comments that this is unrealistic. One in particular, the link to the environment. They've even got Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, to say, you know what? They're coloring outside the lines. That's not really their job. Their job was supposed to be nutrition. Whereas there's really a pretty active vocal group. I signed this thing that ended up being on a one-page ad in the New York Times, and oh my God, I get 10 emails a day now that I signed this thing from this group. It's actually pretty well organized, saying, you know, we got to push back on the food industry. Let's show them all the scientists that believe in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's recommendations and the scientists who spent 2 years looking at the evidence. There really is evidence for the environmental connection, and that's another link to change some people's behavior. At the end of the day, what we're after is behavior change. And what Rob was talking about was how sugar affects our behavior because it's driving a lot of our behaviors, but there's other strategies. So let's focus on the positive strategies. I teach a class on the Stanford campus. Doesn't talk about health at all. It talks about animal rights and welfare, climate change, human labor abuses in slaughterhouses and fast food workers. Almost every student in the class changes their diet because they're engaged in a bigger issue, a broader issue. And so at the level of the government, we have these dietary guidelines going on. There's currently a battle. I'm going to tell you what I predict is going to happen. I predict in 2015 they reject a lot of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's recommendations, just like so many communities rejected a soda tax. And I heard Marco Wooten one time from the Center for Science and Public Interest listen to somebody give a talk about, oh my God, here's all the great things we did to get the soda tax passed, and it failed, and we're crestfallen. And she stood up and said, bravo, you got that out there again, that soda tax? Really, this is a really ingrained thing. This is grassroots. Keep pushing, pushing, pushing. And what happened in Berkeley this year? They passed a soda tax. What happened with gay marriage? No, no, no. Oh, now 37 states? Okay, I'm going to guess in a few years we get 37 states with a soda tax. And I'm going to guess the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's recommendations are not taken this round because the link to the environment is a little too new and the discussion hasn't gone on. But you have to get this in the dialogue. I'll bet you in 2020 the link is made. That's my prediction. You guys can write it down today. Get back to me in 5 years, okay?
And the other thing...
by the way, these recommendations are not new. The 2005 Dietary Guidelines Committee made these recommendations. Janet King, who's at Children's Oakland Research Institute, was the chairwoman of that Dietary Guidelines Committee, and she told me that they submitted to the USDA a 480-page document in 2003, 80 pages on sugar, 80 pages on fiber. And when the final document from the USDA came out, it was a total of 80 pages instead of 480, and everything about sugar and fiber had been removed. And I said to her, I said, Janet, are you kidding me? You didn't have any recourse? And she says, we're an advisory committee. We have no teeth.
But it's becoming more and more obvious, so I'm hopeful. I'm more optimistic, maybe. I don't know. Am I more optimistic than you?
I think you are.
Should we take another question so we can roll through?
Could I just say yes, but so if everybody in the room could write to the USDA by May 8th, that's one thing.
Yeah.
And the other thing for ALEC is to go on the Common Cause website, because we've gotten 300 companies who are members of ALEC down to 102. And there are still companies like Coca-Cola that are part of that. But if you join what the Common Cause push, they're all getting out of it little by little. Thank you very much.
What are your positions on artificial sweeteners?
You could ask me because I actually got selected to write the American Heart Association's position on artificial sweeteners. Okay, you ready for this? We don't have enough data to have a position. I'll tell you how confusing it is. I mean, it actually sounds simple. The one area where it could be the simplest is actually Coke. In our world, when we set up experiments, there are lots of confounders, as Rob has done a nice job explaining, right? Coke is actually the one sort of simplest place to do it because you just have a regular Coke or a Diet Coke. Although there's a difference, the regular Coke folks got more calories. So was it the sugar or was it the Coke? Okay, so anyway, you've got artificial sweeteners in this thing. And if you look at all the available data, it's inadequate to make a definitive conclusion. You can actually say, so actually here's a general conclusion that we came up from looking at the papers. General, not definitive. So we never have really adequate evidence for super definitive, but we have partial evidence and we make the best statement we can. It looks like when you add sugar to food and replace it with artificial sweetener, later in the day you compensate for some of that and you make up for some of the calories you missed from the sugar, but not so much when you drink beverages and you switch to an artificial sweetener. The beverage thing, you overcompensate for that, and so the beverages are a little different than the food, and so The sodas are worse. Like, you don't know you're drinking, you don't get satiated from the Coke calories. The artificial sweeteners can help you show that that shift is a little better with beverages. So sodas are one of the things we should cut back the most on. And I looked at, and when we're all done with this, said there's inadequate evidence. I thought, as a scientist, and I always need grant money, let's see, maybe I should write one of these new studies to look at artificial sweeteners. And then I thought, oh, I don't want to do that. Then really I'm studying to see if packaged processed food with artificial sweeteners is better than adding sugar to food. I don't even want to touch that. So there really isn't adequate evidence to provide that. And at the end, I actually got approached by a dietitian who was on our writing panel and said, please be very cautious what you say. I have a diabetic patient who's drinking a big gulp every single day. I got them to a smaller dose and diet soda. If you say you can't find a difference between artificial sweetener and Diet Coke, he's going to go back to real Coke. I don't care if you can prove that or not. Don't let my patient go back to that big gulp. And so we had to couch it as, it looks like it's bad. We can't really prove that the sugar, I'm sorry, it looks like the artificial sweeteners are helpful. We can't definitively prove it. How about coffee? What if you're going to have coffee every day and you're going to sweeten it, and you're either going to put sugar or artificial sweetener? I don't know, I would say the artificial sweetener, but you're going to have the coffee every day anyway. So you're going to have to put it in the context of what you're adding it to. My biggest fear is we just keep perpetuating our sugar palate. So where do artificial sweeteners go? Packaged, processed crap. So is it helpful to go from sugar to artificial sweetener? Yeah, because you have a little less glucose and fructose, but in the end, it's really a slippery slope. Sorry for the lack of answer.
And your point, your question is very, very well taken. We understand, but what do you do with this? What I would argue is that diet sweeteners are like methadone. If you're trying to get a heroin addict off heroin, you put them on methadone and then you wean the methadone down. The problem is the methadone clinics don't do it. They just keep you on it. If you're using diet sweeteners to get people off sugar because sugar is addictive, and so you get them onto diet sweeteners and then wean it down, then that would be a good thing to do. But that's not what we do. So think of it in that, with that analogy. Maybe that'll help.
Thanks, good question. Next, please.
So I read an article, and it was like in the newspaper or maybe a magazine. It wasn't a scientific magazine or article. And I can't remember if it was artificial sweeteners or high fructose corn syrup, but they said that it changes the gut bacteria.
It was the artificial sweeteners.
Okay.
Elenov in Science, September 2014. So it apparently changes the gut microbiota, the bacteria in the gut, and led to glucose intolerance in animals. Now, we don't know if that's true in humans yet.
I would say it's preliminary.
It's preliminary.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is it another reason to not have artificial sweeteners in packaged processed food? Sure, if that works for you, it works for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
I couldn't agree more.
Do you know, as of yet, if there has been any class action lawsuit, so similar to the tobacco industry, regarding the sugar industry? Or I'm kind of interested, what's the call to action as far as what we can do? I mean, I think if anybody works here, we can certainly ask our corporate offices to get those vending machines and those candy bars that are right at the cafeterias, just still enticing us to take that sugar. But I am interested if there's been anything about any lawsuits.
I can answer that. So I went to law school for this reason.
Yay!
I don't have a JD. I have an MSL, Master's of Studies in Law, so I can't sue, but I can talk to people who can. And they talk to me. So I actually know the deal on this. So the initial lawsuits were for misbranding, and you may have heard of those. In fact, one of them was right here in San Jose, Cane v. Chobani. Familiar with that one? That was basically about evaporated cane juice. So evaporated cane juice is not a sanctioned sweetener by the FDA. But every yogurt says evaporated cane juice because it sounds healthy. Because if you said, oh, it's sugar, well, gee, why is there sugar in my yogurt? Evaporated cane juice sounds good, right? Except it's not a sanctioned sweetener. So basically every carton of yogurt that says evaporated cane juice is by definition misbranded. and you were entitled to your money back. And so there was a class action lawsuit in Superior Court of Northern California. Lucy Coe, the same judge who did Apple v. Samsung, presided over that, and it ended up at the Ninth Circuit and was ultimately dismissed. And we can talk about why that was. There's one individual case of a minor, of a 12-year-old, who sued high fructose corn syrup manufacturers for her type 2 diabetes in Buffalo, New York. And that was also dismissed, but it was dismissed for very inappropriate reasons because the judge didn't get it, and it may come back in another guise. And then finally, there are several plaintiffs' attorneys who have approached me about class action lawsuits and trying to decide what the appropriate plaintiff would be. And I can tell you what the appropriate plaintiff would be: adolescents with type 2 diabetes. Because the baseline was 0, and we have the causation, we have the proof, and so, and they're a very, shall we say, also a lot of them are minority, which works well in court. And so they're a very sympathetic plaintiff. So we're going to see what happens over the next couple of years.
Good luck on that. Thank you.
Hi, Steve.
So do you have any comments on the milk mandate? So that we're actually, it's one thing to have recommendations. The dietary guidelines are recommendations for how people should eat. But it's another thing to actually enforce that and force our kids to get fatter. And the remarkable thing is that I've talked to school administrators and said, hey, the government is actually not allowing you to serve whole milk or 2% milk. It has to be 1% or less. And the only studies I could find all show that that makes the kids fatter. Because, and they're going to eat more sugars and because we're taking the fat out of their diet. And so there's actually, it's actually required for schools to make our kids fatter. And I'm amazed that parents aren't up in arms about the government actually making our kids less healthy.
You want to take that?
It's a really tough question, really. So the dairy thing is actually, maybe in theory, one of the biggest public health successes in their eyes, because they took this whole fat and people thought that lower fat was more watery and not good tasting, and now people try it and it's the norm. They have low fat. The data for getting at that kind of question are really tough. So Dariush Mosfarian did this fabulous paper in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at whole milk and low fat and looking over time. They have this new model. They've been following nurses and health professionals forever. It was always just observational association, but now they have change every 4 years and change in other things. So now, instead of just looking at association, they say they're looking at change versus change, which is a little contrived, to be perfectly honest. But what was really fascinating was the whole milk versus the reduced fat milk on weight had no impact.
No, but there's a...
it was 0.
That's on his study. There's an actual clinical trial that was done at University of Virginia on this.
It says low fat makes them fatter. So let me make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Whole fat makes them fatter, or low fat makes them fatter?
Well, when they restricted the milk, just like the USDA is requiring of schools, kids got fatter.
I'm still not clear. Restricting milk or restricting the type of milk?
Restricted
the fat in the milk.
Yeah, but they took the fat. Basically, they switched. They took the fat out of milk by moving the fat out of the milk. Kids got fatter.
And it wasn't because they switched to chocolate milk?
No.
Because that's what happens. That's the reason that the dietitians in the schools say they have to have chocolate milk, is because, well, no one would drink the low-fat milk otherwise, because it doesn't taste good. We all grew up on whole milk, and it was perfectly fine, and there was no problem, and then you take the fat out of the milk, and then you have to do something to substitute.
Yeah.
So you look at Berkeley Farms 1% chocolate milk, okay? It's got an extra 60 calories, all of which are high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah. Well, but the point is, there was actual clinical data, a clinical study that proved that if you did exactly what the USDA did, that kids would get fatter. And I asked the USDA, because I got routed to, because I know all the guys there, I got routed to the right person. I said, hey, do you have any actually, there was a study that showed kids get fatter. Do you have any study at all that shows that kids actually lose weight when you cut the fat out of the milk? and they stopped responding at that point.
Yeah. Well, and one of the issues is it's a single study. So in any of these things that are big questions, you need to replicate it again and again.
But you can't go and base food policy when, if you have a single study that says kids do get fatter and you have no studies at all that show the opposite, then it's unbelievable that we require them, based on no scientific data whatsoever, that conflicts with the study that we do have.
I won't argue with you. The fact of the matter is, one of the reasons Credit Suisse came out with its response in that slide I showed you is because they could not find any studies anywhere that said that sugar had a health benefit. So they said, if you're trying to prove the null hypothesis, that proved the null hypothesis. I mean, they did their own science. The fact of the matter is, you're saying the same thing. There are no studies that say that low fat is good for you. The only thing we said was that we had to go low fat. So you find a study that says low fat is good for you. There are none. In fact, that's what the Women's Health Initiative showed, is that low fat is not good for you, but we're still doing it.
Well, I wouldn't go there. That's touchy. We could get into that. But I would say, so Steve, your question is answerable. We could do more of those studies. If more of those studies got funded, we have a lot of questions that are difficult to answer. If you wanted to look at weight in kids, shifting back and forth from whole milk to low-fat milk, that's an answerable question. There should be dozens of those right now, and they're not.
But there was a study, and it makes total sense, right? Because when you have the fat in the milk, the fat makes you less hungry, so you eat fewer calories and you get less fat. The fat doesn't raise your insulin and so forth. So everything about that study made intuitive sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the science matched everything we know about metabolism.
Well, we haven't gotten rid of the low-fat directive yet.
No, we haven't.
No.
After all these years. And in fact, I mean, you never talked about the history of the dietary guidelines, but it was all driven by George McGovern. And it was not based on any science.
Actually, it wasn't driven by George McGovern. It was driven by the food industry.
Well, but McGovern was really it was politically motivated, and the scientists at the time were against it because there was no evidence that said cutting cutting fat will make you thin.
So let me bring up a parallel example that could be useful, unless Nora has a point because she's raising her finger. Running on time. Okay, I'm going to make this a quick example. How many of you know that on food stamps you can buy soda with your food stamps? And food stamps, the name now is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Sugar from soda doesn't seem to be much of an assistance. So Bloomberg said in New York City, we would like to do a trial, not really impose this, we would like to do a trial with this USDA program and see if we can ban the purchase of sodas with SNAP dollars, but you have to get USDA approval to do this kind of trial. The USDA turned them down. The beverage company opposed the trial. The Hunger Coalition of New York City opposed the trial. Minnesota actually proposed that they change it not just for soda, but also for junk food. If you're going to get food stamps, you should only be able to buy a certain number of foods. It's kind of ridiculous because WIC is another federal program, and you can't buy crap with WIC. You have to buy good food. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of pushback. And to the point that Steve is just making, one of the issues is that sounds obvious that if you can't buy soda, you'll buy something better. But it's not necessarily true. What if you didn't spend the money on soda and you bought a candy bar? You actually have to do that study to see what happens when you don't have this thing, what the next behavior is. So they're waiting for those studies, and there aren't enough. And we should have more.
Could you go back to the advisory committee whose advice is being ignored? Is there an alternative way to get the information out? The dietary advisory committee?
Is there an alternate way to get it out?
Well,
when they sign up for the committee, do they promise not to go around there or something?
Oh, yes, they do. No question about that. The 15 scientists who are part of the DGAC, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, have to basically sign their life away and say they won't talk about it outside of administrative channels. That's absolutely true, yes. So I mean, we're trying to do it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why sugarscience.org exists, is to try to get the information out. You know, that's one of the reasons why all these documentaries are being made right now, is to try to get the information out. But, you know, it's hard. It's hard, and they have a much, much more expensive mouthpiece.
But is there a sort of equivalent format Who puts out the dietary recommendations? I've lost the
The USDA. They actually trade back and forth between the USDA and the DHHS. They're responsible for the final document. They rotate off every 5 years. So part of it is writing Tom Vilsack, part of it is making a comment. Part of it is better evidence, and part of it is getting funded to do that evidence and getting it reported. So we're actually doing a pretty neat paper right now to look at how much protein Americans think they need, how much they eat, how misinformed they are, how much protein America produces through livestock, that Americans eat more meat than any country in the entire planet, and yet the cattle industry and the egg industry and the pork board and everything else say you need all that protein because Americans are freaked out about protein. And we're linking that on the Stanford campus with environmental scientists who are taking the health perspective, linking it with what the shift would be in agricultural policy in terms of what we're growing, and trying to show the environmental impact and the health overlap. And Kathleen Merrigan, who is the Undersecretary of Agriculture under Vilsack for a long time, said, please send me that paper as soon as you have written it. I want to read it and help you get it published and get it out there so that we have more evidence, so that when the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee goes in and says we're making this recommendation, and the Beef Council says you can't make that recommendation, there isn't enough evidence, we can say yes, there is. There's more evidence. Will my one paper do this? No, not at all. But that's what our job is. Our job is to figure out what those gaps are in the evidence and try to put it together in a digestible, communicable way.
I guess I was looking for the sort of in the same format so I could take the one that gets published and the one that should have been published and carry the non-existent one around with me when I want to look at the back of a package label.
Oh, you want to carry it around with you? The 571-page document is online, including a 7-page executive summary. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert. I had a question about the Pepsi-Cola chief scientist. I was wondering if you could share a little more about what that person said in terms
I don't know what that person said. I wasn't allowed in the room.
Oh, okay.
I just know she was there.
Really?
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, no, I wasn't allowed in there.
I wondered why you didn't comment on that.
Are you kidding? That the food industry does not want to be on the same dais as a scientist who's not bought off.
Well, just a broader question then. What are the opponents to your arguments that work in the food industry?
So
what are the worst things they say and the best things they say?
If you want, I can show you.
Well,
I mean, seriously, the sugar industry has some very specific talking points that they promulgate and they trot out. In fact, I'm going to have this argument with John Stephen Piper at the International Diabetes Federation in December. And I've debated food industry concerns on 2 other occasions, so I'm very prepared for this. The first thing they say is, number 1, sugar has a low glycemic index. So, everybody understand glycemic index? Everybody know what it is? So glycemic index is defined as how high does your blood glucose rise when you consume 50 grams of carbohydrate in a specific food. That's the definition of glycemic index. And indeed, sugar has a low glycemic index because half of it is fructose, not glucose. So the glycemic index of sugar is 53. The glycemic index of fructose alone is 19. Everybody with me? Those are low glycemic index foods. Who cares? Glycemic index is a canard. Glycemic index doesn't matter. What matters is glycemic load. Because glycemic load is defined as how much food do you have to eat to get the 50 grams of carbohydrate. So the perfect example of how this works is carrots. So carrots have a relatively high glycemic index. If you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, your blood sugar will go pretty high. But you have to eat 1.3 pounds of carrots to get 50 grams of carbohydrate. You have to eat the whole friggin' Grimway truck.
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, right, in 5 minutes. Ain't gonna happen. So carrots are high glycemic index, low glycemic load. So if you believe glycemic index, you would stay away from carrots. Carrots are the best thing you can possibly put in your mouth, okay?
Broccoli.
Huh?
Broccoli.
And broccoli, carrots and broccoli. Second problem with glycemic index is the fact that fructose doesn't cause its problems because of its glycemic index. It's beyond glycemic index. Fructose causes its problems because of its stereochemistry, and it binds to proteins. So when you overwhelms the liver's capacity to extract it on the first pass, which happens at about an 8-ounce soda, you get a serum fructose level. So Fructose does not raise your serum glucose, it raises your serum fructose, which is even worse because that binds inside the arteries, causes aging of the arteries, causes aging of proteins, causes this thing called the Maillard reaction. It's the reason you paint barbecue sauce on your meat before you grill it to get that nice brown color. We're all browning even as we speak, and fructose does it 7 times faster than glucose. If I opened you up, if I did, if I did a heart operation on you right now, your cartilage would be brown. And I can show you the picture if you want of newborn rib cartilage, nice and white, against 88-year-old rib cartilage, nice and brown. Because we're all browning, it's part of aging. And if something causes you to age faster, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it has nothing to do with glycemic index. So that's the first thing they say. Second thing they say, a little fructose causes an improvement in insulin response. It's a phenomenon that was first observed by Sherrington back in 1968. Bottom line, there's a fructose receptor on the beta cell. And so when you consume a 20-ounce soda, you're getting a huge insulin response. And that's actually driving all these chronic metabolic diseases. So when you overdo it, that's actually a problem. That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. They would say that's a good thing because it's helping clear blood sugar. That's not true. Okay? The next thing they would say is that it's all on the label for you to decide yourself, except that's not true either, because it's total sugars. It's not added sugars. You don't know what they added. Okay? And the perfect example of that is yogurt. So we talked about yogurt before. So how many grams of sugar in a plain yogurt? 7. That's all lactose, milk sugar, no problem. Your liver turns the galactose into glucose like that. How many grams of sugar in a pomegranate yogurt?
22.
So when you consume, thank you. When you consume, so when you consume a pomegranate yogurt, you are consuming a plain yogurt plus a bowl of Captain Crunch. Now, did you know that? But if you look at the side of the package, it's total sugars. You don't know what's endogenous, you don't know what's not a problem, and you don't know what's added. And the same thing for whole fruit. You know, I mean, people say, oh, but there's sugar in fruit, right? But yeah, but there's an equal amount of fiber. And the fiber mitigates the negative responses of sugar on your digestive and on your system and on your liver. Why? Because the fiber causes a gel to form on the inside of your intestine. The insoluble fiber forms the scaffolding, and then the soluble fiber plugs up the holes. It's kind of like the hair catcher on your bathtub drain. Okay, it's a little plastic lattice work, and when the hair falls off your body and covers the holes, you get a barrier, and the water doesn't go down until you clean it off, right? Okay, same thing's happening in your intestine. When you consume the insoluble and the soluble fiber together, you're getting this gel, which is preventing the rate of absorption from the gut into the bloodstream, thereby keeping your liver safe, because it changes the flux from the gut to the liver, which is a good thing. In addition, because you develop that gel, because you make that gel, more of the calories that you consume, since they're not getting absorbed high up in the duodenum, they're getting transported further down the jejunum, further down the intestine, where the bacteria live. That's where the microbiota are. They have to eat too. So what do they eat? Well, they eat what you eat. The question is, how much did you get versus how much did they get? So when you consume foods containing fiber, they get more. So that means you didn't even absorb it. So you consumed it, but you didn't absorb it, which is another reason why a calorie is not a calorie. Because when you consume your sugar with fiber, or you consume any nutrient with fiber, you're getting less, and the bacteria are getting more. And then that means the good bacteria will proliferate, like Bacteroides, and the bad bacteria won't, like Firmicutes, which has been shown to cause chronic metabolic disease because it releases more cytokines. So bottom line, when you consume your food with fiber, you're mitigating all those negative effects. That's called real food. Processed food is fiberless food. And so you get, basically when you eat processed food, you're getting it all. And you're getting it right away, and it's driving your liver nuts.
I think we're going to have to let that be the last question for this evening. I think we could go on and on and on.
But did you know your speakers will be up here, some of them who want to volunteer to answer one-on-one questions, but out of respect for your time and Nora's.
Thank you so much, both of you. This has been an incredibly illuminating evening.
Thanks for the good questions.